Sometimes the stories we remember best are the ones we remember least accurately. More than 100 years after the sinking of the Titanic, millions of people around the world believe they already know one of the ship's most unforgettable moments. They picture a group of musicians standing together beneath the cold night sky, continuing to perform as everything around them slowly changed. Many can even name the song they believe was played at the very end. It has appeared in books, paintings, documentaries, feature films, and countless conversations, becoming one of the most enduring images in maritime history. Yet when historians began examining the original evidence more closely, an unexpected question emerged. How much of this famous story comes directly from eyewitness testimony, and how much has been shaped by memory, tradition, and more than a century of retelling? That question is where our investigation begins. This is not an attempt to diminish one of history's most moving accounts, nor is it an effort to replace inspiration with skepticism. Instead, it is an invitation to look beyond the legend and return to the people who were actually there. The historical record surrounding the final music aboard the Titanic is both fascinating and surprisingly complicated. Some survivors remembered hearing music long after the collision. Others recalled different melodies. A few could not remember any specific song at all. Newspapers published dramatic accounts within days of the disaster, while later books introduced additional details that became widely accepted over time. As each generation repeated the story, certain elements grew stronger, even when the supporting evidence remained uncertain. This is how many historical legends are born. They do not begin as deliberate inventions. They begin with real events, incomplete memories, emotional experiences, and a human desire to find meaning in moments that seem almost impossible to explain. That makes the final music aboard the Titanic far more than a simple historical question. It becomes a case study in how memory itself evolves. Consider the circumstances. It was a cold April night in the North Atlantic. Hundreds of people experienced the same unfolding event from different locations across an enormous ship. Some were inside elegant public rooms. Others stood on open decks. Some focused entirely on their families. Others concentrated on instructions from officers or crew members. Under those conditions, it would be remarkable if every witness remembered exactly the same sequence of sounds, conversations, and moments. Modern historians understand this well. Eyewitness testimony is invaluable, but it is rarely identical. That does not make it unreliable. It makes it human. So before we ask what the musicians played, we must ask something even more important. What can the surviving evidence actually tell us? Which details appear consistently across independent accounts, and which emerged only years later? Somewhere between documented fact and enduring legend lies the truth of what happened during those final hours. Finding that truth requires us to set aside everything we think we know and approach this story the way every careful investigator should, not by asking what has been repeated the most, but by asking what the evidence is truly capable of revealing. To understand why this story became one of the most enduring memories of the voyage, we first need to understand the role music played long before the collision ever occurred. In the early 20th century, ocean travel was not simply a means of crossing the Atlantic. For many passengers, especially those traveling in first class, it was an experience carefully designed to reflect elegance, refinement, and modern luxury. Music was an essential part of that atmosphere. It accompanied breakfast, afternoon tea, evening conversations, and formal dinners, creating a sense of comfort that distinguished the finest passenger liners from ordinary ships. Among the musicians aboard was Wallace Hartley, an experienced violinist who had spent years performing on passenger vessels. By 1912, musicians like Hartley were not considered members of the ship's navigation crew. They were employed to provide entertainment, selected because of their professionalism, discipline, and ability to perform in demanding environments. Historical records indicate that the ensemble consisted of 8 musicians who normally performed in smaller groups depending on the occasion. During the day, different combinations played in various public rooms, while evening performances often accompanied formal dining or social gatherings. Their repertoire reflected the tastes of the era. Light classical selections, popular salon music, waltzes, and contemporary compositions filled the grand public spaces, allowing passengers from different backgrounds to enjoy familiar melodies while crossing the Atlantic. Contemporary newspapers and surviving passenger accounts described the atmosphere aboard as remarkably sophisticated. The great public rooms were filled with polished wood, crystal lighting, elegant furnishings, and conversations that blended business, travel, and family life. Music quietly connected those spaces, often becoming so familiar that many passengers barely noticed its presence. That detail may seem insignificant, but it helps explain why later memories proved so difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Human beings often remember sounds differently than visual events, particularly when those sounds form part of an everyday environment rather than a dramatic interruption. Before the collision, there was nothing unusual about hearing musicians perform. It was exactly what passengers expected throughout the voyage. This ordinary routine would later become extraordinary only because of the circumstances surrounding it. Another important detail often overlooked is that no one aboard could have known they were participating in what history would remember as one of the most famous voyages ever undertaken. The musicians began that crossing with the same expectations as everyone else. Their responsibilities were straightforward, their performances followed established schedules, and nothing in the historical record suggests they anticipated playing any role beyond entertaining passengers during a routine Atlantic journey. That context matters because it reminds us not to interpret their actions through the knowledge gained afterward. Like every other person aboard, they experienced events as they unfolded, without the benefit of hindsight. As the evening of April 14th progressed, conversations continued, music blended naturally into the elegant surroundings, and life aboard followed its familiar rhythm. No audience paused to wonder whether a melody might someday become part of history. No musician could have imagined that future generations would debate not only whether they continued performing, but also exactly what they played. Yet within only a few hours, the ordinary sound that had quietly accompanied everyday life would become the center of one of the greatest historical mysteries ever associated with the voyage. The investigation now reaches the point where ordinary routine gave way to uncertainty. At approximately 11:40 in the evening on April 14th, the collision interrupted what had been an otherwise peaceful voyage. Yet one of the most remarkable details preserved in survivor testimony is how little many passengers understood in those first moments. The impact was not universally described as dramatic. Several witnesses later recalled feeling only a slight vibration or gentle shudder, while others noticed little more than an unusual pause in the ship's motion. Inside the elegant public rooms, conversations continued, card games were interrupted only briefly, and many passengers remained unaware that anything truly serious had happened. This context is essential because it explains why the earliest reports concerning the musicians differ so significantly. If people did not immediately recognize the danger, they were unlikely to pay close attention to exactly when music stopped, resumed, or changed location. Historical evidence suggests that the musicians responded sometime after the collision, but the precise sequence remains difficult to reconstruct. Some survivors believe they first heard music inside the first-class lounge before the performers later gathered on the open deck. Others remembered hearing music only after they had already reached the boat deck. A few witnesses admitted they could not clearly remember when the music began at all. These differences are exactly what historians expect when examining independent eyewitness accounts recorded after an emotionally overwhelming event. Rather than indicating deception, they reveal the natural limitations of human memory. One point, however, appears with notable consistency. Multiple survivor testimonies describe music continuing as passengers gradually assembled on deck and crew members began preparing lifeboats. At that stage, the atmosphere remained surprisingly orderly. Officers encouraged calm, many travelers still believed there was no immediate danger, and the familiar sound of live music fit naturally within that atmosphere. This has led some historians to suggest that the performances may have helped preserve a sense of routine rather than serving as a dramatic gesture. It is an interpretation supported by context, although no surviving order from the ship's officers has ever been found instructing the musicians to perform. That distinction matters. There is no documented evidence proving they were commanded to continue playing, nor is there evidence proving the decision was entirely spontaneous. The surviving record simply does not allow such certainty. Wallace Hartley himself left no written account explaining his thinking during those moments, leaving historians dependent upon the observations of those around him. As the evening progressed and more passengers gathered outside, the sound of music became increasingly memorable precisely because everything else was beginning to change. People who later struggled to remember exact conversations often remembered hearing familiar melodies drifting across the deck. Yet even here, the details remain surprisingly elusive. Witnesses agreed that music was present, but they did not always agree about when it started, where the musicians stood, or how long they continued. Those unanswered questions form the foundation of one of the greatest historical debates surrounding the voyage. If the people who actually heard the performances could not completely agree about the sequence of events, how can modern historians determine which memories deserve the greatest confidence? The answer lies not in finding one perfect witness, but in carefully comparing every surviving account until the strongest patterns begin to emerge. As investigators compare the surviving testimony, a pattern quickly becomes clear. The most striking disagreement is not whether music was played, but what people believed they heard. At first glance, that may seem like a minor detail. In reality, it is the very reason this moment remains one of the most debated episodes in the ship's history. If dozens of eyewitnesses experienced the same event, why did they leave behind such different memories? The answer begins with the witnesses themselves. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, stood in different parts of the ship, and observed the unfolding situation under very different circumstances. Some were close enough to distinguish individual instruments. Others heard only faint melodies carried across the open deck by the wind. Some later gave formal testimony within weeks of the disaster, while others shared their recollections years afterward, when memory had already begun to blend with public discussion and newspaper reports. One frequently cited witness recalled hearing cheerful selections intended to reassure passengers that everything remained under control. Another remembered slower, more reflective music as the evening progressed. Others admitted they recognized familiar tunes but could not identify specific titles. There were also survivors who never mentioned music at all, not because it was absent, but because their attention was focused entirely on finding loved ones, following crew instructions, or simply trying to understand what was happening around them. Silence in a testimony should never be mistaken for evidence that something did not occur. Historians are careful to distinguish between what a witness observed and what a witness chose to remember. This is one of the most important principles in historical investigation. Every testimony contains valuable information, but no single testimony tells the entire story. Instead, researchers compare independent accounts, looking for details that appear repeatedly without obvious influence from one another. In this case, several points seem remarkably consistent. Multiple survivors remembered hearing live music after passengers began gathering on deck. Several described the musicians as calm and professional. None of the earliest reliable accounts suggest panic among the performers themselves. Beyond those broad observations, however, certainty begins to fade. Even the physical location of the musicians has been debated. Some accounts place them near the first-class entrance, while others remembered them gathering farther along the boat deck. It is entirely possible that both memories are correct if the ensemble changed position during the course of the evening, but no surviving document confirms the exact sequence. The same uncertainty applies to the music itself. A melody heard from a distance on an open deck can easily be mistaken for another, particularly when several popular hymns and light classical pieces shared similar musical characteristics familiar to audiences of the early 20th century. Modern studies of memory reinforce this possibility. Researchers have repeatedly found that people often remember the emotional meaning of an experience more accurately than its precise sensory details. In other words, a survivor may accurately remember that the music felt comforting without accurately recalling every note that was played. That distinction may explain why so many testimonies agree on the purpose the music seemed to serve, even while disagreeing about its exact content. As more statements are examined side by side, one question grows even larger than before. If eyewitnesses could not agree on the melodies they heard, how did one particular hymn eventually become accepted by much of the world as the final song of that unforgettable night? By this point in the investigation, one name has quietly risen above every other possibility. For generations, countless books, documentaries, and films have identified the final hymn as "Nearer, My God, to Thee." It has become so deeply woven into popular memory that many people assume it is an established historical fact. Yet when historians return to the earliest evidence, they discover a far more complicated picture. The question is not whether the hymn was meaningful. It unquestionably was. The question is whether we can confidently say that it was the final piece the musicians performed. The strongest connection between Wallace Hartley and the hymn came from people who knew him before the voyage. According to later accounts, Hartley had once expressed that if he ever found himself facing great danger, "Nearer, My God, to Thee" would be among the pieces he would wish to play. That personal association gave the story extraordinary emotional power, especially after news of the disaster spread across the world. Newspapers embraced it, memorial services repeated it, and before long the hymn became inseparable from the public image of the musicians. Yet emotional resonance is not the same as historical proof. When researchers compare eyewitness testimony recorded soon after the disaster, they encounter an unexpected obstacle. Several survivors identified different melodies. Some remembered lively tunes earlier in the evening. Others recalled hearing hymns but could not confidently identify which one. A number of witnesses never named a specific composition at all. Even more intriguing is the fact that "Nearer, My God, to Thee" itself existed in multiple musical settings during the early 20th century. In Britain, one version was commonly known as Horbury, while many American congregations were more familiar with a different melody called Bethany. This seemingly small detail has fueled decades of scholarly discussion. If a witness recognized the hymn, which arrangement did they actually hear? Could different listeners have interpreted similar melodies according to the versions they already knew? The surviving evidence offers no definitive answer. Historians have also noted that memory can become remarkably vulnerable after a widely shared public narrative takes hold. Once newspapers, memorial ceremonies, and published books consistently associated the hymn with the musicians, later recollections may have been influenced, even unintentionally, by the story that society had already accepted. This does not imply dishonesty. It reflects a well-documented characteristic of human memory. People often remember experiences through the lens of later information, sincerely believing those memories have remained unchanged. For that reason, modern historical methodology places greater weight on independent contemporary testimony than on recollections recorded many years afterward. Even with that careful approach, however, certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. The available evidence allows historians to say that music continued during part of the evacuation and that hymns may have been included among the selections performed. It does not allow anyone to state with complete confidence exactly which piece was played last. That distinction is crucial because Sacred Mysteries is not interested in preserving comforting assumptions or dismissing cherished traditions. It is interested in understanding where evidence ends and where belief begins. Ironically, the uncertainty surrounding the final hymn may reveal something even more profound than the answer itself. If history cannot conclusively identify the last melody, why did the musicians continue playing at all? That question leads beyond the music and directly into the character, judgment, and purpose of the people holding the instruments. Once the investigation moves beyond the question of which song may have been played, a deeper question emerges, one that historians have debated for decades. Why did the musicians continue performing at all? It is tempting to search for a single answer, but the surviving evidence suggests that reality was almost certainly more complex. No written order has ever been discovered instructing Wallace Hartley or the other members of the ensemble to keep playing after the collision. Likewise, no first-hand statement from Hartley survives explaining his intentions. What remains are observations from survivors, contemporary reports, and the broader professional culture of passenger liners during the early 20th century. Together, they offer several possible explanations, each supported to different degrees, yet none capable of standing alone as the definitive answer. The first possibility is simple professionalism. These men had spent years performing aboard passenger ships where maintaining a calm and welcoming atmosphere was part of everyday life. In uncertain situations, continuing their work may have felt less like an extraordinary act and more like the natural extension of their responsibilities. Professional musicians are trained to focus on their performance despite distractions, and that discipline may have shaped their decisions during those early stages when the full seriousness of the situation was still becoming clear. A second explanation centers on reassurance. Multiple survivor accounts describe an atmosphere that remained relatively orderly for a significant period after the collision. Passengers were encouraged to remain calm while lifeboats were prepared, and many still believed there was little immediate cause for alarm. Familiar music could have reinforced that sense of stability. Without speaking a single word, it communicated that routines were continuing, that trained professionals remained composed, and that there was no reason for widespread panic. Whether this effect was intentional or simply a natural consequence of continuing to play cannot be determined with certainty, but the testimonies consistently suggest that the music contributed to the mood many passengers experienced during those moments. A third possibility reflects the character of the musicians themselves. Wallace Hartley had earned a reputation as a dependable and disciplined performer long before joining the voyage. Those who knew him described a man who took his work seriously and approached his profession with quiet dedication. While personal character alone cannot explain every decision made that night, it provides valuable context. Historians often remind us that extraordinary actions are frequently rooted in ordinary habits developed over many years. People under pressure rarely become entirely different individuals. More often, they rely on the values and routines that have guided them throughout their lives. There is also another perspective worth considering. Perhaps the musicians did not see themselves as making history. They were responding to unfolding events one moment at a time, without knowing how those events would ultimately be remembered. Future generations often compress long and complicated experiences into a single symbolic image, but the people living through those moments seldom recognize that symbolism as it is happening. What later became an iconic scene may simply have been a series of practical decisions made by experienced professionals adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. That possibility reminds us to be cautious when interpreting historical actions through modern expectations. The farther we move from the event itself, the easier it becomes to assign motives that cannot be verified. Yet regardless of why the musicians continued to perform, another transformation was already beginning. Their actions were no longer being remembered only by the people who heard them. They were becoming part of a story that newspapers, memorial services, books, and eventually films would carry across generations, gradually turning a historical event into one of the most enduring legends of the 20th century. As the years passed, the music itself became only part of the story. What truly endured was the meaning people attached to it. Within days of the disaster, newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic began publishing dramatic accounts of the musicians who had continued performing while events unfolded around them. Reporters worked under enormous pressure, often relying on incomplete survivor interviews transmitted across oceans by telegraph. Some details were confirmed, others remained uncertain, and a few were repeated before they could ever be fully verified. Yet the public was searching for something more than a timeline of events. They were searching for examples of dignity, courage, and composure in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. The musicians provided exactly that symbol. Memorial services held throughout Britain, the United States, and Canada reinforced this image. Churches spoke of devotion. Editorials praised quiet professionalism. Communities raised funds to support the families left behind. Wallace Hartley, once known primarily within the world of professional musicians, became an international figure whose name represented far more than his career. His violin itself would eventually become one of the most recognizable artifacts associated with the disaster, not because it answered historical questions, but because it embodied the story people wanted to remember. As decades passed, books expanded upon the narrative. Authors drew upon survivor testimony, newspaper reports, official inquiries, and personal recollections, but they also interpreted those sources through the values of their own generation. Each retelling emphasized slightly different details. Some focused on sacrifice. Others highlighted discipline or faith. The musicians gradually transformed from historical individuals into cultural symbols. By the middle of the 20th century, the image had become so familiar that many readers encountered it without realizing which elements came directly from contemporary evidence and which had been strengthened through repetition. Then came another powerful influence: cinema. Motion pictures possess an extraordinary ability to shape collective memory because they replace imagination with vivid visual scenes. When audiences watched actors portraying the musicians continuing their performance during the final hours, those cinematic images often became more memorable than written testimony. For many people, the emotional experience of watching the story unfold on screen blended seamlessly with their understanding of the historical record. This phenomenon is neither unusual nor unique to this event. Historians frequently observe that films can influence public memory more profoundly than archival documents, especially when those films are created with remarkable emotional authenticity. The result is that generations who never opened an official inquiry or read first-hand testimony may still feel certain they know exactly how the scene unfolded. Yet certainty is not always the same as evidence. This distinction lies at the heart of responsible historical investigation. Legends rarely emerge because people intend to distort the past. More often, they emerge because a particular version of events captures something emotionally true, even when certain factual details remain uncertain. The image of musicians calmly performing has endured because it represents qualities that transcend the disaster itself. It speaks to professionalism, composure, compassion, and the human desire to bring comfort during moments of uncertainty. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as later generations imagined becomes, for many people, less important than what the story symbolizes. For historians, however, symbolism can never replace documentation. The challenge is to appreciate the power of the legend without allowing it to overshadow the surviving evidence. That balance requires returning once more to the historical record itself. After separating newspaper narratives, later memoirs, cultural memory, and cinematic interpretation, we are left with one final task. We must examine every category of evidence on its own terms and ask a simple but demanding question. What can the historical record actually establish beyond reasonable doubt, and where does uncertainty still remain? After examining the witness testimony, the published accounts, and the cultural legacy that followed, the investigation reaches its most important stage. Every historical mystery eventually arrives at the same point, where emotion must give way to evidence. Instead of asking what people have believed for more than a century, we must ask what the historical record can actually support. The answer is both satisfying and surprisingly incomplete. Let us begin with what can be established with a high degree of confidence. Multiple independent survivor accounts indicate that the musicians continued performing for at least part of the evacuation. This conclusion does not depend on a single witness or a single newspaper article. It appears across numerous contemporary testimonies collected independently after the disaster. While individual memories differ in detail, they consistently point toward the presence of live music during the unfolding emergency. That is the strongest historical foundation of the entire story. The next category consists of evidence that is plausible but cannot be confirmed with complete certainty. It is highly likely that Wallace Hartley remained with the other members of the ensemble as they continued performing. Contemporary descriptions repeatedly associate him with the group, and his leadership role makes this conclusion reasonable. Likewise, many historians believe the music was intended to maintain an atmosphere of calm among passengers. This interpretation fits both the available testimony and the practical circumstances aboard the ship. However, because no written instruction or personal statement survives to explain the musician's intentions, it remains an informed interpretation rather than an established fact. Beyond that lies the territory of tradition. The belief that "Nearer, my God, to thee" was the final hymn belongs in this category. The tradition is supported by later recollections, by Hartley's personal association with the hymn, and by the powerful role it played in public memorials. Yet tradition is not identical to documented evidence. Contemporary eyewitnesses did not unanimously identify the hymn, and several remembered different melodies altogether. As a result, responsible historians cannot state that the final selection has been conclusively identified. Finally, there are the questions that remain genuinely unanswered. We do not know the exact sequence of every piece performed after the collision. We do not know the precise location of the ensemble throughout the evening at every moment. We do not know whether the musicians consciously viewed their performance as an act of reassurance, personal duty, quiet faith, or simply professional routine. Those answers disappeared with the men who could have provided them. Accepting these uncertainties is not a weakness in historical research. It is one of its greatest strengths. Honest investigation recognizes the difference between confidence and certainty. It allows evidence to define the limits of our conclusions rather than forcing conclusions beyond the evidence. In many ways, this approach reveals something even more meaningful than a definitive answer ever could. It reminds us that history is rarely a collection of perfect certainties. More often, it is a careful conversation between surviving documents, human memory, physical evidence, and thoughtful interpretation. Some questions are resolved completely. Others remain open, not because historians have failed, but because the historical record itself has limits that cannot be crossed. After more than 100 years of research, we now stand as close to the truth as the surviving evidence allows. What remains is not another theory to prove, but one final reflection on why this story continues to resonate so deeply with people who were born generations after the events themselves. After following every available witness, comparing every surviving testimony, and separating documented evidence from later tradition, we arrive at an answer that is both humbling and profoundly human. The historical record does not allow us to identify with complete certainty the final piece of music performed that night. It cannot tell us the exact order of every melody, the precise moment each selection began or ended, or every thought that passed through the minds of the musicians. Some mysteries remain beyond the reach of even the most careful investigation. Yet that does not mean the search has failed. In many ways, it has revealed something far more valuable than a single title written on a page. It has shown us how history is remembered, how memory changes over time, and how ordinary human actions can become extraordinary symbols. The deeper we looked into the evidence, the more the question quietly shifted. It was never only about identifying one final hymn. It became a question about why this particular story has continued to resonate across generations while countless other moments from that voyage slowly faded into history. The answer may lie in something universal. Music has always occupied a unique place in human experience. It accompanies celebration, reflection, hope, uncertainty, and remembrance. Long after specific words are forgotten, a melody can preserve emotion in a way few other things can. Perhaps that is why this moment has endured for more than a century. Whether listeners remembered every note correctly became less important than what those notes represented. To the people who later told the story, the music symbolized calm in uncertainty, professionalism under pressure, and the quiet determination to continue. Fulfilling one's purpose even when the future could not be seen clearly. Those meanings were powerful enough to outlive debates over individual details. At the same time, responsible history asks us to resist the temptation to replace uncertainty with comforting conclusions. There is dignity in admitting that some answers remain incomplete. Historians do not measure success by eliminating every mystery. They measure success by understanding exactly where the evidence leads and recognizing where it ends. In this case, the evidence leads us remarkably far. It tells us that music continued after the collision. It tells us that multiple independent witnesses remembered hearing the musicians perform. It tells us that Wallace Hartley and his fellow performers became lasting symbols because their actions left a profound impression on those who survived. Beyond those points, however, the historical record grows quieter. That silence should not frustrate us. It should remind us that the past is not a perfectly preserved recording waiting to be replayed. It is a mosaic assembled from fragments, each carrying part of the truth, but rarely the whole picture. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson this investigation offers. The pursuit of truth is not about forcing certainty where none exists. It is about respecting the evidence, questioning assumptions, and remaining willing to accept that some mysteries continue to invite reflection rather than final answers. More than 100 years later, the last music of that unforgettable night still echoes, not because we know every note with absolute certainty, but because it reminds us that history is ultimately shaped by people, memory, and meaning. And sometimes, the most honest conclusion is also the most enduring one. We simply do not know every detail of what was played, but we understand far better why the story has never stopped being heard.